Cool. Thank you, Scott. And good morning, everyone. It's always a joy to come and to preach, those few times I do every year. And nice to see still a reasonably healthy number here on a holiday like this. This time I have been given a choice of what to preach from, which is wonderful, but is also can be a challenge, trying to think of what would be helpful for the body. And I've deviated a little bit from the script, so to speak. Normally over summer we would do something a bit sort of light and easy, Psalms or something like that. But I'm going to take on Revelation, so I'm going to go for it and see where we get to. But there is a bit of a reason for this, and part of that is that we spent quite a while in our home groups looking at the book of Revelation. And that was really awesome to, get into it a bit more, try and understand some of this difficult book. And also, as Scott said, last Sunday of the year, a good time to preach from the last book of the Bible. I wonder if you've ever heard the phrase before that you don't want to be on the wrong side of history. Often it's used in defense of some progressive cause, sometimes a good cause, sometimes a not so good cause. And it's used, the implication, of course, is that we don't want to be looked back on in 100 years' time by another generation and think, oh, they were so slow, they were so entrenched in their ways and they couldn't see the better way. Well, Revelation tells us quite definitively, doesn't it, who is going to be on the right side of history. So it's quite exciting to read and to understand and to see what God's plan is for his people. But we know Revelation is a hard book to tackle, isn't it? It's full of symbols, we know that, and we might not know what these symbols mean. Sometimes it might not be a symbol at all. Maybe it refers to something literal. Sometimes it may be a fully symbolic thing. Do these things refer to specific events or people, or do they refer to general trends or shapes of things? And then we have the chronology. How do we know if an event takes place in the past, or if it's happening right now, or if it's something that's going to happen in the future? These things are hard to understand, and often people come to Revelation with one of two kind of mindsets. The first one being that some people get really engrossed in it. They pore over the numbers and the symbols, and they interpret everything, and they construct a framework into which you would place everything, and so it sort of becomes a watertight kind of explanation of the end times. And in some ways it can be like a code that needs to be cracked. And these can be used to make some definitive predictions about this thing refers to this government, or this thing refers to that person, or this symbol means this thing. So that's one group. And then there are other people who take the other approach where they throw their hands in the air and they say they could never understand it. It's too hard. Maybe there's a few people here today like that. That was certainly me until we did this series in our home groups. And often I think this is the result of seeing all these debates, seeing things being misused perhaps, maybe seeing all the theological positions and all these large words like premillennialism and dispensationalism and things like that can turn people away. And maybe they tell themselves that they're content just knowing that God is in control, therefore I don't need to know. After all, how would it affect my day at work tomorrow, or how would it affect how we run our church? But there's also problems with this approach, in that if we believe that all Scripture is God-breathed, as 2 Timothy tells us, then this is also a part of God's Word that we need to understand. So there is a better way. We can understand Revelation, perhaps not all the details, but we can understand the shape of it. We can understand what God is saying to the church. And we can do so without going to the full extent of trying to understand every last bit. And part of the key to understanding is this, to see that Revelation doesn't stand by itself. It doesn't stand alone. Revelation is part of the Bible, and we see this through the use of the imagery. So a lot of imagery is borrowed from other books of the Bible. Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah would be the major ones, but also lots of other books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Psalms, Lamentations. The Bible is linked together. So being a part of the entire witness of Scripture, we should read it in line with the rest of Scripture, not as an isolated message. So obviously in one sermon, I'm not going to be able to unpack all of it. That would require months, and perhaps sometime as a church we might do a series on Revelation and we'll have that chance. But what I want to do today is give a broad picture of Revelation. What is the point and what should our response be? Now, just to get any disappointments out of the way early, I'm not going to be talking about the Antichrist and who he or she may be. I'm not going to talk about the 666 and numerology. I'm not going to talk about the millennium, and I'm definitely not going to talk about the rapture. What I am going to talk about are three of the symbols that sort of tie together the whole book, and so to take a bit of a journey through the book by looking at these three symbols. So let's get into it. Firstly, the 7 lampstands. So these are introduced to us right at the start in chapter 1, verse 12. And John turns and he says that he saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. And we're not left wondering too long what the golden lampstands are, because in verse 20, Jesus tells John in this vision that the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. This lampstand is also an image used in Zechariah chapter 4, although with a slightly different sort of nuanced meaning there. But sometimes we forget, don't we, that Revelation is a letter to the churches. We can get carried away with the interpretation of all the imagery and trying to understand what it means for society and nations and the world, and even for us right now. But firstly, all of those things are important. But firstly, we forget that primarily John was writing this letter to real churches. It says it was written to the churches in Asia, from chapter 1, verse 4. This is a region of what is now modern-day Turkey. And the intent of this letter would have been that it would be distributed through all of the churches in that region. Now, why 7 churches? Well, the number 7 crops up a lot of times in Revelation, so we shouldn't avoid that fact. And 7 tends to represent God's completeness, the wholeness of God. So we have the 7 churches which are meant to represent the complete church, the church at large. So it was a letter for those churches, but it's also a letter for a wider audience, firstly throughout Asia, also throughout the Christian world at the time. And of course, it's in Scripture, it's in the canon, it's for us, it's for the church now. So we can apply it to ourselves and to our own situation. And knowing this, that it is applied to the churches, knowing it's for the churches, gives us the context that we need for the whole book. So the letter to the churches is not just in chapters 2 and 3, which are explicitly the letters to the church, where they're addressed directly, but the whole book is a letter to the churches. I'm sure many of you would have heard in the past sermons on chapters 2 and 3 specifically, because it's a bit easier, well, not because it's easier, but it is easier and it's more directly applicable to churches nowadays because they're dealing with real issues. But in John's vision, these 3 chapters at the start of the book, they sort of set up a bit of a tension. So these churches are struggling. Some are struggling with sin. They have worldliness. Some of them have promiscuity. But others are walking in righteousness and they're suffering because of that. Some of them have persecution. And John tells us that each of these 7 churches, there's a promise to the one who conquers. Notice that in all of the letters to the churches. So they will be granted to eat of the tree of life to the church at Ephesus. They'll not be hurt by the second death to the church in Smyrna. They'll be given the hidden manna and a white stone to the church in Pergamum. They'll be given the morning star as the promise to the church in Thyatira. They'll be clothed in white garments to Sardis, and they'll be made a pillar in the temple of God to the church in Philadelphia. So this question is set up from these chapters. Will the church conquer? Will they achieve this? Will they be given the riches of heaven? Or will they fall into compromise and sin? Will they fall to the beast and his kingdom? And the next question is, how is this battle going to be played out? So the rest of the book of Revelation answers these questions. The rest of the book is not a third-party kind of abstract commentary, but it is for the churches. It is encouragement. It tells them to hold fast and warns them not to succumb to the beast and to the kingdom of Babylon. And it comforts the churches to know that victory in the end belongs to the Lord. And we're told, of course, that the Lord walks in the midst of the lampstands as part of this image, that he is with the church and he protects it and he purifies it. So we need to read the rest of the book with this in mind. So that's the first one, the lampstands. Secondly, the vision of the 7 seals. So the body of the letter of Revelation is made up of the opening of these 7 seals and the further images that come out of them. So here we're moving into the middle chunk of the book from chapter 6 through to 16. And we can sort of group these together. So we have the 7 seals, then we have the 7 trumpets that the angels blow, and the 7 bowls. And they sort of come together with similar kind of imagery coming out of each one. So these 7s represent God's acts of judgment. These are events coming, or in some cases having already come. Again, notice the number 7 comes up again, symbolizing in this case the completeness of God's plan. Now with these 7s, there's 2 sort of main schools of interpretation here. So the first one is that each of these group of 7s represents discrete events. So firstly the scrolls, then the trumpets, and then the bowls. So separate events. The other interpretation, which personally I believe is more likely, is that each of these groupings is a cycle, or what we would say a recapitulation. There's a big word for you, of the same events happening again, but from different perspectives. So firstly, we have the 7 seals in chapters 6 to 8. We have the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse as the first 4 seals that are opened. And then we have the perseverance of the martyrs, number 5. And then the 6th seal is the day of the Lord, the final judgment. And then the 7th seal is opened, and from that seal come the 7 angels with the 7 trumpets. And again, we get into more judgments as the trumpets are blown. This time they mirror the plagues from Exodus, the plagues on Egypt. And eventually this wraps up in chapter 11 with the reign of the Lord following his judgment. Then, finally, we get into the 7 bowls of God's wrath, which again mirror the plagues of Egypt from Exodus. And again, the 7th bowl ends with the day of the Lord. So all of this appears to be a retelling of God's judgment. Again, this isn't universally agreed, but this seems the more likely framework here. So, why are these important? What do we do with these 7 seals? 2 things. Firstly, it shows us that the Lamb is guiding history to its conclusion. I was a child of the 90s. I am a child of the 90s, and one of the most familiar movies to me growing up was The Lion King. The original Lion King, of course, not this real animal remake kind of carry on. But in The Lion King, a generation of Western kids were taught about reincarnation. The circle of life is the first song, and it's kind of the theme. So Mufasa tells Simba, you die and you become the soil, and the soil, turns into grass, and the antelope eat the grass, and everything goes around in a big cycle. It's borrowed from Hinduism. And in this kind of view, which is shared with, most Eastern sort of religions, history and life just carries on in this endless cycle, repeating itself. This is just a personal take here, but I wonder if it's not a coincidence that so many in the Western world have adopted lots of Eastern religious concepts over the past couple of generations, things like karma you hear a lot of these days, and concepts of universalism and polytheism and all that kind of thing. But what we see here in Revelation is quite different, isn't it? It's that history is not a circle that keeps going around and around forever. History is a line, and the line ends with Jesus. If you think about a scroll, these are wax seals on a scroll. If you undo a seal, you can't do it back up again. That's kind of the point of a seal on a scroll. It kind of tells you that it's been opened. The same thing with the bowls and the trumpets. The bowls, once they're poured out, that's it. It's done. Jesus is the one in charge, and there is no do-over. Secondly, what we can see here is that God protects his true followers through the judgment. So in the midst of the opening of the seals, we have this intermission, which is in chapter 7, which Scott read for us earlier. And in this vision, John sees the 4 angels protecting God's children. Verse 3 says, "Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads." Now here's an interesting thing to note. John hears something. He hears the number of how many have been sealed. 144,000, 12,000 from each of the tribes of Israel. So it's like a census, like a counting of the people. So that's what he hears. But then it says later that John turns and he sees. And what does he see? He sees the fulfillment, the surprising fulfillment of that prophecy in verse 9, which is what? A great multitude that no one could number. From every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands. It's an amazing picture, isn't it? God doesn't just save 144,000 Israelites. He saves and protects a multitude that no one could number. People from all people and all tribes. And we see these similar passages dotted throughout different places in Revelation. God's people will suffer, no doubt about that. In some cases, even martyred. But from God's final judgment of sin and Satan and death, his people will be protected. We will be protected, such that they emerge in chapter 19 victorious and they sit down to eat the marriage supper of the Lamb. How good is it to know that even though these signs are confusing and scary, that God does protect his own? It reminds me of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4:17, which we talked about not too long ago in our series on 1 Thessalonians. And Paul tells us when he's explaining about how things will happen with the coming of the Lord, and he says, "So we will always be with the Lord." So he's reminding us that throughout everything, he will never leave us. He'll never depart. He will be there. Right, third image I want to look into is Babylon. I don't know if anyone here listens to reggae music, but you'll know that from reggae music that Babylon gets a lot of airtime. I was curious about this, so I did look it up, and I thought initially that Rastafarians must be pro-Babylon, but interesting to learn that for them, Babylon is a symbol of oppression, whether it is the government or the police or just the world systems of finance and structures and things like that. And so the dream for the Rastafarian is to be freed or emancipated, as they often put it, from Babylon and to be able to go into Zion. Babylon, broadly speaking, represents the world in opposition to God. And it stands in a contrast with the heavenly city of Jerusalem. And Babylon in Revelation is part of this complex realm of evil that John sees, led by the beast in all his forms, which includes the dragon, the serpent, the beasts, the prostitute we see in chapter 17. The false prophet comes up in chapter 16. And we also have associated sort of characters too, like the merchants who profit off Babylon and all her riches. Kevin de Jong put it quite nicely like this. He said, "Wherever worldliness in a culture makes sin look impressive or attractive or pervasive, as if there is no other option to get along in the world other than to sin, that's Babylon. Whatever the world does to press upon you this sense, well, everyone lives this way, that's Babylon." Now, a couple of notes, just as an aside, on evil in Revelation and how it's portrayed. Firstly, the visions are often portrayed as ugly or grotesque even. We see this in the description of the beast and the dragon in chapters 12 and 13. 7 heads, 10 horns. One of them is like a jumble of animals. So even in their symbolic forms, it's made clear that they are abominations. They're full of corruption and they're perversions of God's good creation. And second thing to see is that they're often portrayed as counterfeits. Some of the characters have this initial appearance of something good, similar to something good. The false prophet is an obvious example of this, but some of them are more subtle, like, for instance, the beast has a mortal wound, which has been healed. That's chapter 13, verse 3. So it's a kind of a counterfeit resurrection, which he is worshipped for. The beast, as we said before, has 10 crowns. That's kind of an imitation of Christ's many crowns. And as we often have heard, that this is Satan's primary strategy. He will try and imitate the appearance of Christ's perfection and salvation as a pitfall for us. But back to Babylon. Babylon, of course, in literal sense, was the city where God's people were exiled after the fall of Jerusalem in 2 Kings. And as an ancient city, it was a center of pagan worship and oppression. So Isaiah prophesied about Babylon's fall, saying, "I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant and lay low the pompous pride of the ruthless." Isaiah 13:11. So the hallmarks of Babylon are there: arrogance, ruthlessness. If you want to read more on Babylon, Jeremiah goes into a lot more detail. In Revelation, Babylon is introduced in no uncertain terms to us in chapter 14, verse 8. The angel declares, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries." So this little introduction sets the tone for Babylon's portrayal throughout the rest of Revelation, that the city's fall is inevitable due to its pervasive wickedness, which has influenced and corrupted the nations across the world. In Revelation, though, this historical context is expanded to give a bit of a broader concept of spiritual and moral corruption. So it becomes a symbol of any kind of entity or society that leads people away from God and indulges in sinful practices. So it doesn't just represent one city or one culture or one earthly kingdom. So what do we do with the symbol of Babylon? How should we respond? This is not an easy task. If we understand Babylon to be the world in rebellion to God, then it's all around us, isn't it? And until Christ returns, we will not be free entirely from it. And we are called to live in the world. Jesus prays in John 17 that his followers not be taken out of the world, but protected from the evil one within it. But perhaps we could take some guidance from Jeremiah when he was speaking to Israelites who were exiled in Babylon itself, back in the time of the exile, from Jeremiah 29. He says, "Build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, take wives and have sons and daughters, take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters, multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." In other words, the instruction is to carry on living. But as we're living in the world, we need to be aware of the Babylon around us. And I suggest that we do that in three ways. Firstly, we need to recognize it. We need to be discerning about what is part of God's good kingdom and what is part of Babylon. Some of these things are obvious, aren't they? Like flagrant sin, or some statements from world leaders that may be in direct opposition to God. Those things are really clear. Or kingdoms that are based on false religions. But some of these things are a lot more subtle, like greed and oppression, even systems that are set up to favor the rich. Excessive luxury is a theme that comes up, with no regard to the poor. Some forms of entertainment or amusement. Corruption, shady business deals, or unjust economic sanctions. These are things that aren't always easy to spot, and we need to ask for the Spirit to help us to sniff these out. And the second thing we need to do is flee from it. The command in Revelation is to come out. Again, we cannot come out of the world itself, but we can flee from Babylon, and we should do that. Once we recognize the influence of Satan in something, we run away from it. Jesus tells us, doesn't he, to take drastic action to remove ourselves from sin. He says, cut off your hand or gouge out your eye if it's causing you to sin. This kind of metaphor that he uses. So it's better to miss out than to keep ourselves in Babylon. Sooner or later, we will be asked to compromise our faith, and we'll be promised a great deal in return. Some people, acceptance or money or some sort of luxury, but that is the point that we need to turn and run. And thirdly, with Babylon, we shouldn't necessarily seek to reform it. We know that the end of Babylon comes in Revelation 18, so you can read about it there. It will burn. The city will burn. The smoke will rise. Babylon will not be dissolved. Babylon will not be returned to Christ or reformed. Of course, the people, the souls that are in Babylon, that are infatuated with her, they can be saved, and that is our mission, to save these souls. But Babylon herself and these systems is going to fall. If we think back to Exodus, God's people were not told to stay and to fix Egypt, were they? They were protected through the plagues, and then they were brought out of it. And then think again, like Lot and his wife, they're fleeing from Sodom and Gomorrah. The same thing, they were told to flee and not look back, which his wife famously disobeyed. So if this is, and the same imagery is used in Revelation, if this is the end of Babylon, we would not expect to see evil and corruption just to gradually melt away over the years until one day that we have this kind of utopia. What we're told here is that Babylon's destruction will be swift, it will be sudden, and it will be final. So our job is to flee from it and to call on others to do the same. Okay, so that is our three symbols. But I want to talk about one more. I know I said three, so we'll treat this one as a bonus. Now, we saw earlier that John heard about the 144,000 from Israel, and then he turned and he saw a surprising fulfillment about that they were innumerable and that they weren't just Israelites, but from every tongue and nation. Well, something a bit like this happens a bit earlier in Revelation 2, back in chapter 5. So John hears something from one of the elders. He hears that the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered. That's verse 5. So he hears about a fierce lion. But then he turns, and what does he see? From the kid spot, a lamb, standing as though it had been slain, in verse 6. And this is the image I want to finish with. So when we're faced with such a powerful adversary like the dragon or the beast or the city of Babylon, you would think that we need a powerful creature to be on our side to fight for us. And that is exactly what Jesus is. He is the Lion of Judah. We know that from the Old Testament. But what is surprising here is how that is fulfilled. God is showing us here that his power is demonstrated in something weak, a lamb who is slaughtered. And this slain and resurrected lamb, he is the one who reigns with God and carries history to its final conclusion. The main character of Revelation is not the Lion of Judah. The main character is the lamb who's been slain. So, how is victory won through the lamb? As you heard before, we have some lambs in the paddock next door, and it's kind of hard to see them being victorious over a snail, let alone a dragon. It's just not going to happen. So how is that? The answer, of course, doesn't come through combat or military or some devouring, but the answer is found at the cross. Jesus on the cross, his resurrection from the grave. That's it. And this is the whole story of where Revelation points us. Again, the Bible is a whole unit. The Bible is linked. Revelation is not telling us something completely different. We're brought back to the cross. Victory has already been won. Satan has already been defeated. The judgment of God on his enemies is still coming. where Satan and his followers will enter the second death and be thrown into the lake of fire. But the battle itself, we are told, is already won. Got my notes a bit mixed up there, sorry. There it is. So I wonder if that is surprising for you. We all hear about these battles in Revelation. We try and imagine what it's like. And certainly in the spiritual realm, these battles are very real. And God's judgment is real, and God's judgment is coming. But the real battle has been won. The real battle is already complete. Jesus said, "It is finished." In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul summarizes the gospel like this in verses 23 to 25. He says, "But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." What a comfort it is for us to know that through the blood of the Lamb that the victory is already won for us. We know how it ends, with us worshipping together at the marriage supper of the Lamb. And we look forward to it, don't we? And we have this meal here that helps us be reminded of this every week, which we'll take soon. So let me pray, and then we'll go into the Lord's Supper.